Foundation's International Watershed Coordinator in January 2023. Teika is a longtime participant in the regional watershed science, policy, and governance activities. She has served as a board member for the International Joint Commission's International Rainy Lake of the Woods Watershed Board and co-chaired the board's Community Advisory Group, Engagement Committee, and the Adaptive Management Committee. Teika has also been helping to guide the IJC board's work on the climate adaptation since 2016. Teika comes to the foundation following several years at Climate Action Network, where she helped grow the network to 150 civil society member organizations and cultivate a powerful team of diplomats and climate policy experts under her leadership as managing director. At the local level, Teika continues to contribute as chair of the City of Kenora's Sustainable Advisory Committee. Born and raised in Kenora, Teika lives with her husband Mike and their children Maya and Sam in the off-grid house they built just outside of town. Teika holds a master's degree in evolutionary biology from the University of British Columbia. Welcome, Teika.
Thank you. So thank you very much for that introduction. I am impressed that you got all the titles right. There are many words to the title that I now hold. I am the International Watershed Coordinator for the Lake of the Woods Water Sustainability. This is a role I took on at the beginning of this year, so in January. Prior to that, as mentioned in my bio, I've spent the last 5 years working nationally and internationally for Climate Action Network Canada, based out of Ottawa, but I lived here and worked remotely. And I ran that organization, which basically represents Canadian civil society, domestically and abroad, in negotiating climate policy and diplomatic affairs having to do with climate change. So climate is really my area of professional expertise over the past decade or so. But I have been involved in watershed work since 2013, when the Regional Watershed Board through the International Joint Commission was established. So in my talk today, I'm going to just run you through some of the governance that's in place for our watershed. I'll remind you of what our watershed is and how we manage water here, who all the partners are, what sorts of things we work on. I can tell you a bit about our forum that happened last week, and if you have any questions, if there's anything you want to know, feel free to interrupt me at any time, but we can have a discussion at the end too. So I was really pleased that you start out with the 4-way test. It is the foundation of good governance. I love good governance. It's really invaluable to being able to get things done and to being accountable for decisions that are made. So I will go back to the slide at the end. You can write down my contact information if you want it. I thought I would start out with just a review of who the Lake of the Woods Water Sustainability Foundation is, what we do. So we are a charitable nonprofit that is based in the region. We have a vision to ensure that the Lake of the Woods waters remain ecologically sustainable and support a healthy economy, healthy society, and beneficial use for current and future generations. We work to maintain the ecological integrity of the Lake of the Woods Basin by working with numerous partners, both through science and public engagement and governance. So to remind you, this is our watershed. It's a really large territory. It essentially overlaps with the Treaty 3 territory on the Canadian side, but it also extends well into Minnesota. A good portion of the watershed is in Ontario and Manitoba, almost 60% of it, and about 40% is down in Minnesota. It's a 70,000 square kilometer watershed. The headwaters are down near Ely, Minnesota. So down in this area, that's the headwaters, and the water flows that way, sort of northwest. The watershed has a management board that is established through the International Joint Commission. I'll go through that in the next slide. And it is an amalgamation of 2 former watershed boards that used to exist since the 1960s. There was a task force in the early 2000s that ended up recommending merging those 2 former boards. And they were boards that were focused around the boundary waters, so around Rainy River. In this area. So there's Namakan Lake, Rainy Lake, and Rainy River, which flows into Lake of the Woods. And Rainy River is the main tributary that feeds Lake of the Woods. About 70% of the nutrients and water that goes into Lake of the Woods comes by way of the Rainy River. So historically, we used to have a board of control that controlled water levels in Rainy River, and there was also a board that looked after ecology. And those have since been merged, and we now have one board that looks after the entire Boundary Waters area, but also Lake of the Woods, and it has an extended mandate to look after both water levels and ecology, aquatic ecosystem health. So thanks to my colleagues at the International Joint Commission, this is a slide they prepared for one of our semi-annual meetings a few years ago. But this is our basic board governance structure through the International Joint Commission. So the International Joint Commission is a binational entity that is shared between Canada and the United States. In Canada, it operates at arm's length from government, but it is enabled through the two federal governments. So in Canada, through Global Affairs Canada, in the US, through the Department of State. The International Joint Commission is stationed in both Ottawa and Washington, DC, and then it appoints regional watershed boards. So across the entire transboundary region between Canada and the US, there are about 16 boards. So they represent all the different watersheds along the transboundary. And then there are also a couple of boards that are interested in issues of particular concern. So for example, the Health Professionals Advisory Board looks after issues relating to health and water. And there is also a series of boards tied to the Great Lakes. So there's a Great Lakes Adaptive Management Board, and there's a Great Lakes Aquatic Ecosystem Health Board, and there's our board. Ours is the International Rainy Lake of the Woods Watershed Board. So we have a committee structure, a governance structure that involves 4 committees and 2 citizen input groups. So the 4 committees are listed here. There's the Adaptive Management Committee, the Water Levels Committee, the Engagement Committee, and the Aquatic Ecosystem Health Committee. And each committee has a chair from the US and a chair from Canada, and I am the Canadian chair of the Adaptive Management Committee at present, though I will be ceding that chair in the next few days as I take on a more formalized role with the International Joint Commission itself. The work of those committees is also informed by a group of citizens. These are just people who are living throughout the basin and have their eyes and ears really tuned into what's going on in the community. That's the Community Advisory Group. And it's split, so there are roughly between 10 and 12 people from each country that sit on the CAG. The Industry Advisory Group similarly has representatives from Canada and the US that represent active industries in the region. So it could be forestry, tourism, mining, water power regulation, all sorts of things like that. And then finally, we have my role, which is the International Watershed Coordinator, and I help to pull together these formal entities under the board with all the different resource agencies and communities in the basin that work on water issues. Okay, maybe I'll go on and just talk a little bit about the International Watershed Coordination Program, but if you have questions about the board committees, I can go back to that in a minute. So the International Watershed Coordinator is a service that's offered by the Lake of the Woods District, or the Lake of the Woods Water Sustainability Foundation. It is a coordinator that sits at the center of a hub of a bunch of different activities that happen across the watershed. So we have all the watershed board pieces through the International Joint Commission. So I work with each of those committees, I work with the board, I work with all of its project partners just to make sure that information is flowing well. I can provide secretariat support, I can help with grant proposal writing, I can do a number of different activities that support the board's work in our basin. This year, I am most focused on advancing a project on water quality objectives and alerts, which I'll talk about in a minute. And also, and that project goes through the Aquatic Ecosystem Health Committee. And then I'm also working on supporting the work of the Adaptive Management Committee, particularly their climate change work. I also work, as I said, with all these different resource agencies that are active in the basin that may or may not be formally represented on the board. People who sit on the watershed board come from expert groups, but don't represent those groups on the board. Like, we all wear our individual hats. We're just ourselves. We don't have any agency affiliation when we sit on the board. But the International Multi-Agency Arrangement, the IMA, is the table where people come from their resource agencies. So Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, Ontario Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, the United States Geological Survey, the US Army Corps of Engineers. These are all agency partners that come and sit on the IMA. The IMA also has representation from Treaty 3, from Grand Council Treaty 3's Territorial Planning Unit, and via the Territorial Planning Unit, other parts of Treaty 3 governance, so the Women's Council, the Two-Spirit Council, the Youth Council, the Elders, they all kind of get their say in our work through their affiliation with Treaty 3 in their governance. We also have representation from the Métis Nation of Ontario, from the Northwest Ontario Region 1 Métis representatives that sit on the IMA and the board. And then I also can work with local groups such as Rotary or anyone else in the community who wants to be engaged in the work that we're doing. Okay, so what am I actually working on this year? I mentioned a few minutes ago this Objectives and Alerts project. So that is actually the core of my work this year. I think many of you probably knew my predecessor, Kelly Saunders. She was the International Watershed Coordinator for many years, and she retired last summer. Kelly did a lot of public engagement and outreach. She worked with youth to do storm sewer stenciling to let people know that whatever you dump down the drains ends up in the lake. She did a lot of classroom talks and taught people about how the watershed works. She had a desktop model for modeling how the watershed works. A lot of that work is kind of on the back burner for me this year. I'm doing a lot less public engagement and outreach than we have done in previous years because we're really focused this year on trying to advance a particular project that we have been trying to do for a number of years. And that is to establish water quality objectives and alert levels on Lake of the Woods and around the boundary waters. I'm sure any of you who are enthusiasts and spend your time out on our beautiful lake know that we have an algae problem. This has been the subject of a lot of scientific research in the past few years. When this board was established in 2013, one of the first tasks it was given by the International Joint Commission was to come up with a plan for science that would be needed to address those concerns that most threaten our aquatic ecosystem. So we developed a water quality plan of study, and out of that plan of study, some of the projects that were recommended have manifested now as actual projects that have been undertaken by different partners, different agencies. In particular, Environment and Climate Change Canada came in 2016 and did a 4 or 5 year binational science program, a science study. It was about $5.5 million that they spent on trying to better understand nutrient flows and what drives algal blooms in our basin. At the same time, in the US, there is federal legislation that can allow the United States Environmental Protection Agency to identify waters as being federally impaired. And that happened for Lake of the Woods many years ago, which then triggered the state of Minnesota to have to do science to support understanding the impairment to the water. So what causes the impairment and what can be done to remedy it? And so there was a very long process called the Minnesota Total Maximum Daily Load Study, which looked at nutrients that go into Lake of the Woods from the Minnesota side. And it ultimately identified that phosphorus is the main nutrient that drives algal blooms, and it's the one that now has to be curtailed. So the Minnesota TMDL recommended that we need to set an objective in Lake of the Woods to reduce phosphorus to a certain level, which is 30 micrograms per liter. And they are implementing a plan on their side to see these water quality objectives be met. On the Canadian side, the Environment and Climate Change Canada science has also honed in on a very similar target. So also recognizing that that threshold for what would constitute impaired waters is probably the same as what was identified in Minnesota, 30 micrograms per liter. So now our task is to actually set a binationally agreed water quality objective for phosphorus. Phosphorus is a nutrient that is abundant in nature, but it also comes about through fertilizers and effluents from sewage treatment plants or from septic fields or all kinds of other industrial uses. And it can come from runoff from soils that are rich in phosphorus, which occur abundantly along the Rainy River, Rainy Lake. So there are a number of different steps that Minnesota is taking to try to reduce the amount of phosphorus that flows in from its side. It's a little bit less clear what Canada can and will be doing. The major point source of phosphorus pollution in Canada used to come from the Resolute Forest Products mill in Fort Frances, but that has been closed, and so we no longer have that major point source of phosphorus. So a lot of what we're seeing in the basin may in fact be legacy nutrient that's buried in the sediment and is getting churned up every year in the Big Traverse in particular, which is a big shallow basin at the south end of Lake of the Woods. When it gets windy there, the soil in the bottom, the sediment gets turned over and a lot of nutrients get released into the water column. And that is why we see major algae blooms down at that end of the basin. So we are aiming to set this water quality objective. An objective is an actual agreed upon goal that is shared between the two countries, between Canada and the US. When the two countries can't come to agreement on establishing a formal objective, we can also turn to alert levels. So an alert level is basically the same sort of idea, only it's saying this is a level at which this contaminant or this concern becomes problematic. And it's just a mechanism for letting the board know we need to do something about this. So we may have alert levels for things like other contaminants, other chemical contaminants. We could have ecosystem health indicators, so different things that suggest that there are problems like fish spawning. We could be looking at fish spawning levels and the success of fish spawning, and that could identify when there's a problem. So the project this year is really just to identify the water quality objective for Lake of the Woods and recommend a plan for monitoring the nutrients throughout the basin, setting up scientific monitoring stations to be able to report and track that. And then also to come up with a short list of alert levels of particular concern. So probably nitrogen, maybe some other chemicals that could be abundant in the watershed and be problematic, and aquatic ecosystem health indicators. This work sounds kind of simple and straightforward, but it's actually really complicated because there are so many different interests in our basin who all have to be heard and have to provide input to both informing what the objective levels should be, what the alert levels should be, but also how do we actually achieve them. So we're doing engagement with Treaty 3, with the Métis, with Minnesota tribes, with all the different resource agencies, with the different governments, and my work is kind of at the center of all that, holding all these different groups together and trying to coordinate them into moving in a direction that results in us having a good scientific framework for maintaining the water quality, the health of the water in our watershed. So that's the big project this year. The other work that I'm undertaking is kind of more in support of that public engagement. So I don't know if any of you ever attended Kelly's Ask an Expert series, but she started that a couple of years ago. And over the summer, I think every week she did a lunch and learn for a few months. So I will be resuscitating that program at some point soon, where you can just tune in and learn about watershed science or governance or all kinds of different things that will be of interest to people from experts in Minnesota, Ontario, and Manitoba, and nationally. So we might talk a bit about climate change impacts. We might talk about the state of the fishery, the health of the fishery. We could talk about all sorts of different things there. Kelly had developed a website that supported all of that work. I presume at some point I will find out how to edit that website and maintain it. So I'm looking forward to that. And then just working with all these different partners through the international multi-agency arrangement. So the IMA also has its own subcommittees. So they work on aquatic invasive species. There's a subcommittee that works on that. And they're looking at things like zebra mussels and quagga mussels coming into our watershed. They are looking at invasive plants and the impact of hybrid cattails or flowering rush or purple loosestrife. Those are some of the examples that we have present in the watershed. So they are identifying those aquatic invasive species, developing tools to track how they're moving through the basin, and doing public outreach and engagement to educate people about how to stop invasives from spreading. They also have, there are committees that work on water quality and on contaminants and on the monitoring program that we're trying to set up this year. So working with all of them. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I need to tell you about. I guess the Watershed Forum is the last piece. So Ron and I were talking about that while everybody was eating. Last week was the International, or the Lake of the Woods Water Sustainability Foundation International Watershed Forum. We held it in International Falls, Minnesota. It was the 20th annual forum. The forum is a science conference, and it was started by the foundation. It's held every March in International Falls. About 130 or so people attend the forum every year, and we have 2 days of talks on watershed science. So this year, many of the talks, so there were talks that focused on this whole objectives and alert levels project, which is underway, and talked about some of the recommendations for that. But a number of the talks focused on climate change and the tools we have to track climate change in our basin, the impacts of climate change, what we can do in future to try to prevent flooding. Flooding is, of course, a major, major concern. So there was a lot of conversation about the impact of the flood last year, how water was regulated, that sort of thing. There were a few talks about ecology, so students talking about the work they've done to look at, for example, the impact of spiny water flea on walleye and whether it makes walleye more susceptible to mercury contamination, and do they bioaccumulate mercury more or less if they are in spiny water flea infested waters. There were students who talked about cyanotoxins, so that's toxic blue-green algae, and the role of nutrients like nitrogen in driving the proliferation of toxic algal blooms. Yeah, there were like a whole range of science talks this year. So you can go to the Lake of the Woods Water Sustainability Foundation website and look for the proceedings reports from all the past 20 years worth of forum presentations. You can get a synopsis of them that's written. This year we actually recorded all the talks, so there will be 24 or so videos that will be available online for you to watch at any time. There were some really great demonstrations of new tools that Grand Council Treaty 3 has developed. So they have a territorial geoportal, which is basically like the whole Treaty 3 map. Users can go in and identify all the different layers of interesting things going on in the landscape. So if you're interested in mining, you can pull up the layers that show all of the historical mine sites or proposed mine sites. That sort of thing is available. You can look at all kinds of different resource management issues through that geoportal. The geoportal is tied to communities in Treaty 3, so some of the information is proprietary to those communities and isn't publicly available, but other elements of it are publicly available, and it's a very cool tool. You can build your own maps of all sorts of things. They also have, they did a demonstration of the new Nibi portal. So Nibi is the Anishinaabe word for water. And Treaty 3 developed the Nibi Declaration last year and spoke about it at the forum last year. The portal is a beautiful resource that is dedicated to the relationship to water and water governance and the spirit of water and understanding of the role and vitality of water. So we were led through that by Elder Priscilla Simard from Couchiching. Yeah, I think that's probably about all I I can think of off the top of my head that would interest all of you about the forum, but for sure, if you have questions, happy to answer them. Yeah, I think that's probably good.